Today, our focus is going to be on long-run economic growth and the story of that process of growth. Let's start by considering Chris, who's a punter on his football team. Last season, he had an average of 42 yards per punt. In the first game this season, he had an average of 50 yards per punt. It raises the question as to whether Chris is a better punter this year than he was last year. The numbers tend to suggest he is. Now, there are some explanations, alternative explanations to this increase in his punting average. It could be that this season he played at elevations, high elevations, where the air was thin and the ball traveled further. Or maybe he had the wind at his back every time he kicked. That could explain the increase in his punting average. Or maybe he spent the summer doing strength and conditioning and working with a kicking coach to perfect his technique. That allowed him to kick the ball further under any conditions. Chris really could be a better punter because his ability to kick the ball increased. Now, this isn't just for football players and athletes, but even musicians face this kind of situation. Madison is a saxophone player who invests her time in working on her technique of playing the saxophone, becoming a better saxophone player. She practices every day, but she wants to be even better. So she starts getting up early in the morning and going for runs to increase her lung capacity so that she doesn't run out of breath, so that she's able to carry notes longer. And this makes her a better saxophone player because that running has increased her ability to play the saxophone. Now, whether this is the distance that we kick the ball, whether it's the quality of the music that we play, the scores that we make on a test, or the production in an economy, we have to ask the question as to why there was an improvement. Any improvement we see, what made that happen? Was it something that just happened in the short run, or was something happening to their ability to do better? Now, economic growth is when economies' potential to produce goods and services increases, not just when it increases its production. This is a concept that sometimes people have a difficult time understanding, and it gets confusing because the media reports that any increase in production was economic growth. Economists always make the distinction between changes in production and changes in our ability to produce. One analogy that might help us clarify and clear up some of the confusion from the media reports is the example of a baseball stadium and the attendance at that stadium. We can see the attendance from game to game vary, but the stadium capacity doesn't change. The number of people that they're able to fit into that stadium is unchanged, even though the number of people that they actually fit into the stadium does vary from game to game. So when we look at production, we're looking at that like in attendance at the game. It may vary, but it's going to vary and it's going to be connected to, though, the capacity, the ability to put people in those seats, or for the economy's ability to produce more goods and services. Economic growth is driven by increases in the amount of productive resources and the level of technology. Now, what are those productive resources? Those productive resources might be, for an agricultural economy, a farmer that has a tractor. With that tractor, he's able to plant more crops and harvest more crops. That tractor is an example of capital. Capital, physical capital, that's the machines, tools, and factories we use to help us be able to produce more goods and services. So when that farmer, the laborer, has that additional capital, he becomes more productive. The agricultural economy becomes more productive. But physical capital isn't the only other productive resource that we can invest in. We can invest in human capital. That is, we send people to school to get training and education. And that training and education allows them to develop skills and abilities that make them more productive, that allow them to produce more goods and services. Now, besides getting more capital, physical or human, we could also get improvements in technology. Improvements in technology are when we figure out ways to get more output from the same resources. One example of that might be the farmer learning that pruning his tomato plants will allow his tomato plants to actually yield more tomatoes. So even though the farmer has the same amount of land and the same amount of labor, he just does things in a different way. He starts to prune these and he's able to get more tomatoes with the same amount of resources. This is an improvement in technology that increases our productive capacity and leads to economic growth. So what are the keys to economic growth? First, we've got to get more productive resources or better technology so that we increase our ability to produce goods and services. How do we do that? Well, let's talk about the story of economic growth from the beginning. Let's go back a step. How can we get more productive resources? It's going to start with the first step, and that is saving. What we're going to have to do is we're going to have to give up some of our current consumption. Why? Because some of our resources are allocated to producing those consumption goods. And if we cut back on consumption, we're able to take the resources being used for those consumption goods and reallocate those resources toward producing capital goods. More human capital, more physical capital. So there's an opportunity cost associated with getting more of those productive resources, and that is giving up some of our current consumption. But when we do that, when we save, we're able to get new capital. Adding new capital is investment. That's the key. We save, which allows us to invest, and that new capital becomes a part of our capital stock. The amount of physical and human capital available to be used in the production of all goods and services. And with those extra resources and better technology, our productive capacity expands. But remember, why are we doing this? Why do we want to be able to produce more? Because we want to enjoy a higher standard of living. Having the ability to produce more can certainly allow us to have more goods and services. We can consume more. It could be about getting more stuff, but it could also be about getting the same amount of stuff and not having to work as much, having more time for leisure and recreation. There's many different ways we can enjoy a higher standard of living, but the only way we can have that higher standard of living is by going back and making sure we increase our productivity, our ability to produce goods and services. Now, before we look at how to graph the story of economic growth in a production possibilities curve model in our next video, it might be worth taking a look at the steps in the process of economic growth and take a look at that worksheet and see how these steps apply in many different circumstances, especially to you as a student.